They lived in my house for 8 years. The night my niece and her husband won $95 million, he looked straight at me and said, "Start packing. This house isn't yours anymore." In my own living room. For a moment nobody moved. The television was still repeating the winning lottery numbers on the screen. Hannah stood frozen in the middle of the room, staring at her phone like it might suddenly change its mind. But it didn't. Every number matched. $95 million. 3 days earlier they had bought the ticket at a gas station on the way home from the grocery store. I still remembered Mark laughing when he scratched it. "Imagine if this thing actually hits," he said. Now it had. And something inside him changed almost instantly. He started walking around the living room slowly, looking at everything the way people do when they already believe it belongs to them. The wooden floors. The tall windows. The staircase leading upstairs. My house. The one I bought more than 20 years ago. The one they moved into 8 years earlier after things got difficult for them. Just for a few months, they said. Mark stopped in the middle of the room and looked at me again. "With the kind of money we have now," he continued casually, "we're obviously moving somewhere better. Bigger house. New neighborhood. New life." He shrugged slightly. "And honestly, it doesn't make sense for you to stay here anymore. Not my name. Not uncle. Just you." Hannah shifted uncomfortably but didn't say anything. Mark crossed his arms and waited. He was expecting anger. Shock. Maybe even begging. Instead, I looked at him for a moment. Then I smiled. "Are you sure about that?" I asked quietly. The confidence in his face flickered for just a second. And in that moment I understood something very important. Mark believed that $95 million had just given him control over everything in this house. What he didn't know was that there was one thing about this house he had never bothered to learn. And by the time he discovered it, it would already be far too late. Mark didn't answer my question right away. For a moment he just stared at me, like he was trying to decide whether I was serious or simply too slow to understand what had just happened. Then he laughed. Not loudly. Just a short, confident laugh. "Yeah," he said. "I'm pretty sure." He turned away from me and walked toward the kitchen as if the conversation was already finished. Hannah followed him. I stayed in my chair near the window, listening. The kitchen wasn't far from the living room, and the house was quiet enough that every word carried easily through the hallway. "You see," Mark said. "This is exactly what I was talking about." Hannah sounded uncertain. "Maybe we should slow down a little. Everything just happened tonight." "Slow down?" Mark repeated. He opened the refrigerator, then closed it again. "Hannah, we just won $95 million. There is no reason to slow down." I heard a chair scrape across the kitchen floor as he sat down. "This place is old," he said. "And let's be honest, it's wasted on him." I could almost see the gesture he made with his hand, the careless way he dismissed the house and everything connected to it. "We sell the house," he continued. "It's simple. Use the money for a down payment on something better. Somewhere modern. A bigger place. Better neighborhood." I could picture the way he leaned back in his chair, already imagining the life he thought he deserved. Hannah didn't answer right away. "But it's his house," she said quietly. There was a short silence. Then Mark sighed like someone explaining something obvious to a child. "Technically," he said slowly, "yes. But come on, Hannah. He's been living alone for years. He doesn't need a whole house anyway." Another pause. "Maybe a small retirement apartment somewhere. He'll manage. Old people don't need much." I leaned back in the chair and looked around the living room. The same room where Hannah used to sit on the floor as a teenager doing her homework while I fixed things around the house. The same room where we had celebrated birthdays and holidays long before Mark ever appeared in the picture. 8 years. 8 years of groceries in my refrigerator, hot water in my shower, lights paid for by my electricity bill. And now, suddenly, $95 million had turned them into people who believed they owned the place. Mark's voice came from the kitchen again. "Tomorrow I'll call a real estate agent," he said. "We'll get the process started." Hannah hesitated. "Maybe we should talk to him first." "We already did," Mark replied. There was the sound of a glass being set on the counter. "He understands." I almost smiled. Because the truth was, he was right about one thing. I did understand. Just not in the way he thought. 8 years earlier, the house had been much quieter. Back then it was just me and the slow rhythm of ordinary days. My name is Harold Bennett. I spent most of my life running a small construction business, nothing glamorous, just repairs, renovations, the kind of work that keeps roofs from leaking and walls from falling apart. It was the kind of work that teaches you how things are built, and how easily they fall apart. Work that paid for this house. I bought the place more than 20 years ago when the neighborhood was still rough around the edges. Most people didn't see much value in it back then. But I did. Good land. Solid structure. Thick old beams that had survived longer than most of the houses around it. I fixed it room by room over the years. New floors. New wiring. A rebuilt staircase. Every corner of the house carried some memory of a long weekend spent working with tools and patience. By the time Hannah called me that evening 8 years ago, the house was the one thing in my life that felt truly stable. She sounded embarrassed on the phone. "Uncle Harold, do you think we could stay with you for a little while?" I didn't even ask many questions. Family doesn't always come with perfect timing. She and Mark had just lost their apartment. Mark's business idea had failed, something involving online sales and investors who disappeared the moment things got difficult. They told me it would only be temporary. Just a few months, Hannah promised. I remember the day they arrived. 2 cars full of boxes. Apologies. Nervous smiles. Mark was polite back then. Very polite. He shook my hand twice when he came through the door. "Thank you for letting us stay here," he said. "We won't be any trouble." For the first few months, they actually tried. They helped with groceries. Mark fixed a broken cabinet door in the kitchen. Hannah cleaned the house more than I ever asked her to. But months slowly turned into a year. Then 2. Then 3. At some point the apologies stopped. The boxes that were supposed to stay in the guest room slowly spread through the rest of the house. Mark began making small changes without asking. First it was furniture. Then decorations. Then entire rooms. One weekend I came home from the hardware store and found my dining table sitting in the garage. Mark had already replaced it with a new one he liked better. "We needed more space in the living room," he explained casually. Another time he replaced the lock on the back door without telling me. "Security upgrade," he said. For a moment I actually wondered if I still had the right key to my own house. I noticed something else over the years. The way he talked about the house began to change. At first it was your place. Then it became this place. And eventually, sometimes, it slipped into our house. I let most of it pass. Not because I didn't notice. But because Hannah was family. And because I believed that eventually they would get back on their feet and move on. 8 years is a long time to wait for something that was supposed to last a few months. But patience becomes a habit after a while. And by the time the lottery ticket changed everything, I had already learned something important about the 2 people living under my roof. Mark believed confidence was the same thing as control. And Hannah had spent so long listening to him that she rarely questioned it anymore. What neither of them realized was that houses remember things. Not memories. Details. The kind of details most people stop paying attention to. And this particular house had one detail they had never bothered to ask about. Not once in 8 years. And that mistake was about to cost them everything. The first time Mark openly treated the house like it belonged to him didn't happen the night of the lottery. It happened years earlier. Back then the changes were smaller, almost quiet. The kind of things people pretend not to notice at first. But one evening made something very clear. The sun was already going down when I came back home. I had spent most of the afternoon repairing a fence along the back of the property. By the time I finished, I was tired, dusty, and ready for a quiet dinner. When I opened the front door, the house was loud. Music. Laughter. Voices I didn't recognize. I stepped into the living room and stopped. There were at least 10 people inside my house. Some of them were already drinking from my glasses. Others were sitting in my chairs like they had always belonged there. One man I had never seen before was standing near the bookshelf, looking through the photographs on the wall. My photographs. For a moment nobody noticed me. Then Hannah saw me standing by the door. "Oh, Uncle Harold," she said quickly. "You're back." Mark appeared from the kitchen holding a bottle of beer. "Hey," he said casually, like I had just walked into someone else's party. "What's going on?" I asked. He looked around the room. "Just a few friends," he said. "We thought it would be nice to have people over." I looked at the kitchen table. Empty pizza boxes. Open bottles. Someone had moved 2 of my chairs into the living room. "You didn't mention anything about this," I said. Mark took a sip of his beer. "It's not a big deal." Then he gestured around the house. "It's just a house." A few of the guests turned their heads toward us. One of them even smiled, like this whole conversation was some kind of entertainment. I kept my voice calm. "You should have asked first." For a second the room grew quieter. Mark looked at me, and for the first time there was something different in his expression. Not apology. Something closer to irritation. "Come on," he said. "Don't make it weird." "I'm not making anything weird," I replied. "This is my house." That's when he smiled. Not a friendly smile. The kind people use when they believe they already know how a conversation will end. "Hannah lives here too," he said. "And honestly, Harold, you've got plenty of space." He gestured toward the hallway. "If you want some quiet, you can just go to your room. We're using the rest of the house tonight." My room. Not my house. Just my room. The words hung in the air for a moment. And suddenly I understood something. One of the guests shifted uncomfortably near the kitchen. Hannah looked down at the floor. Mark waited, arms folded, like he expected me to argue. But I didn't. Instead, I simply looked around the living room. The chairs. The empty bottles. The strangers walking around like they belonged there. Then I nodded once. "Enjoy your evening," I said quietly. I walked down the hallway and closed the door behind me. From the other side of the wall I could hear the music start again. The laughter. The voices. And that was the moment I realized something important. Mark wasn't just living in my house anymore. In his mind, he had already taken it. And that was the first time I understood how far he was willing to go. After the lottery, Mark didn't wait long to start acting like everything in the house had already become his. The change was almost immediate. The next morning I woke up before anyone else. Old habits from years of construction work never really leave you. By the time I walked into the kitchen, the sun had barely come up. Mark was already there. Not drinking coffee. Talking on the phone. "Yes," he was saying, pacing slowly across the kitchen floor. "The property has a lot of potential." He paused, listening. "Well, the house itself is older, but the lot is great. Big backyard. Quiet street. Another pause. Exactly, he said. That's why we want to move quickly. I stepped into the doorway quietly and leaned against the frame. He hadn't noticed me yet. So what kind of timeline are we talking about? Mark continued. A short laugh. 2 weeks would be perfect. That was when he turned around and saw me standing there. For a moment his expression froze. Then he ended the call. Just talking to someone about options, he said casually. I walked to the coffee machine and poured myself a cup. Options? I asked. Mark shrugged. You heard me last night. With the kind of money we have now, staying here doesn't make much sense. He leaned back against the counter. We're already looking at places outside the city. Bigger properties. Something more modern. I took a sip of my coffee. And this house? I asked. Mark glanced around the kitchen again. We'll sell it. He said it the same way someone might talk about selling an old car. No hesitation. No doubt. We'll find a good agent, he continued. Shouldn't be hard with the market right now. At that moment Hannah walked into the kitchen. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept much. What are you talking about? She asked. Just planning ahead, Mark said. We should start preparing the house if we're going to sell it. Hannah frowned slightly. But Uncle Harold still lives here. Mark sighed. Hannah, we talked about this. He gestured toward me like I was a piece of furniture standing in the corner. He barely uses the house anyway. I watched them quietly. Mark continued speaking, his voice calm and confident. We help him find a nice place. Somewhere smaller. Maybe closer to town. A quiet apartment. He'll actually be more comfortable there. Then he added with a small shrug. And honestly, old people don't need much space. Hannah looked from him to me. But this is his house. Mark shook his head slowly. Legally, sure, Mark said. But money changes things. He tapped his fingers against the kitchen counter. We're about to have the kind of money that opens every door. Then he looked directly at me. And honestly, Harold, this place deserves better than just sitting here the way it is. He paused for a second, then added with a thin smile. With the money we have now, we can do things properly. The sentence hung in the air. For a moment the kitchen was completely silent. Hannah shifted uncomfortably again. Mark waited. Probably expecting another argument. Instead, I finished my coffee and set the cup down on the counter. Interesting plan, I said. Mark smiled. I thought you'd see it that way. I nodded slowly. Oh, I do, I replied. What Mark didn't realize was that he had already started a process he didn't understand. Because houses, especially old ones like this, tend to come with histories. And sometimes those histories are written in paperwork people forget to read. By the time Mark learned that lesson, losing the house would be the smallest problem he had. 2 days after the lottery win, Mark decided it was time to make his plans official. It happened during dinner. Hannah had cooked dinner, but the atmosphere in the room felt tense. The plates were on the table, a bottle of wine open between us, but nobody seemed comfortable. Halfway through dinner, Mark leaned back in his chair. So, he said calmly, I've been thinking about the timeline. Hannah looked up from her plate. Timeline for what? For the move, Mark replied. He spoke casually, like someone explaining a simple decision that had already been made. We should probably start preparing the house for sale next week. The room went quiet. Hannah glanced at me, then back at him. Mark. What? He said. We talked about this. Yes, Hannah replied carefully, but we didn't talk about it like that. Mark frowned. Like what? Like he's already leaving. Mark looked at me. Then he shrugged. Well, he is. The words landed on the table like something heavy. I continued eating slowly. Mark watched me for a moment, then continued speaking. I've already been looking at apartments online, he said. Small places. Quiet buildings. Places that are more appropriate. Hannah's voice dropped. Appropriate for who? Mark didn't hesitate. For him. He gestured toward me again, the same careless motion he had used earlier. You can't expect a man his age to maintain a whole house like this. He leaned forward slightly. A small retirement apartment would be more appropriate. A place like that would be more realistic for someone your age. Hannah shifted in her chair. Mark, that's not fair, she said quietly. Mark sighed, clearly annoyed. Hannah, be realistic. He tapped the table with his finger. We just won $95 million. Things are going to change around here. Do you really think we're going to stay in this house forever? No, she said quietly. But it's still his house. Mark leaned back in his chair again. For now. Those two words hung in the air. For now. He turned to me again. Look, he said, his tone suddenly patient, almost friendly. We'll help you find a good place. Something comfortable. Somewhere you won't have to worry about stairs or maintenance. Then he smiled. You'll probably like it better than this old place anyway. Hannah looked like she wanted to say something, but the words never came. I finished the last bite of my dinner and set my fork down slowly. Mark was watching me carefully now. Waiting. Probably expecting anger. Or protest. Instead, I simply wiped my hands with the napkin and looked at him. A retirement apartment? I asked calmly. Mark nodded. It makes sense. I held his gaze for a moment. Then I smiled slightly. That's an interesting idea, I said. Mark relaxed in his chair, clearly satisfied with himself. He already believed the decision had been made. But what he didn't realize was that his little speech had just confirmed something I had already suspected. Mark wasn't just planning to sell the house. In his mind, the house already belonged to him. And the more confident he became, the easier it would be to let him keep talking. Because people who believe they're in control usually make one very predictable mistake. They stop asking questions. And in this house, there was one question Mark had never thought to ask. Not once in 8 years. And that mistake was about to become very expensive. Later that night the house finally became quiet again. But my mind wasn't. Hannah went upstairs early. Mark stayed in the living room for a while, scrolling through real estate listings on his phone like someone shopping for a new pair of shoes. Bigger houses. New neighborhoods. Places far away from this street. From this house. Eventually the lights went off and the hallway grew silent. I stayed awake a little longer. Then I walked to the small desk in my study and opened the bottom drawer. Inside was an old folder I hadn't opened in years. The paper was slightly yellow at the edges, the kind of documents that had been sitting untouched for a very long time. Most people forget about paperwork like that. But people who spend their lives building things learn something important. Houses are not just walls and roofs. They are contracts. Permits. Land records. Agreements signed long before anyone else starts making plans. I sat down at the desk and slowly opened the folder. The first document was the original purchase contract for the property. 23 years old. Back when this neighborhood still looked very different. The second document was the survey map. Property lines. Lot boundaries. Access rights. All the details most people never bother to read. I turned another page. And there it was. The one document that changed everything. A land preservation agreement. Signed when the house was first purchased. At the time it had seemed like a technical detail, something the previous owner had arranged with the city years earlier. But documents like that never really disappear. They simply wait for the moment someone forgets they exist. The agreement was simple. The land itself could not be redeveloped, divided, or transferred without the approval of the original property holder. Not the occupant. Not the resident. The holder. In simple terms, the house couldn't be sold without me. I leaned back in the chair and looked around the room that Mark believed he already owned. For 8 years Mark had walked through this house like he owned it. Like he understood it. Like money could solve every problem standing in his way. But the truth was much simpler. He had spent 8 years inside a system he never bothered to understand. And the more confident he became, the more careless he had grown. I closed the folder slowly and placed it back inside the drawer. Mark believed the lottery had given him control. But control doesn't come from money. It comes from knowing how things actually work. And the moment Mark called that real estate agent, he had already made a very expensive mistake. He just didn't know it yet. Because when people start making plans with $95 million in their pocket, they rarely stop to read the fine print. And in this house, the fine print was everything. The next morning Mark left the house earlier than usual. Like a man who believed everything had already been decided. I heard the front door close and his car start in the driveway. A few seconds later the engine faded down the street. Hannah came into the kitchen not long after. She looked tired. The kind of tired that comes from thinking too much during the night. "Morning," she said quietly. "Morning," I replied. She poured herself some coffee but didn't drink it right away. Instead, she stood near the counter staring at the cup like she was trying to decide what to say. Finally she looked at me. "Uncle Harold, about last night." I raised my hand slightly. "You don't need to explain," I said. She frowned. "But I do." I shook my head. "Mark is excited," I said calmly. "People do strange things when money suddenly appears in their lives." She looked down at the floor. "He didn't mean it the way it sounded." I didn't answer. Because we both knew that wasn't true. After a moment she picked up the cup and took a small sip of coffee. "I'll talk to him," she said. I nodded politely. "That's probably a good idea." She hesitated a moment longer, then quietly left the kitchen. The house became silent again. I finished my coffee, washed the cup, and walked down the hallway to my study. The folder was still in the drawer where I had left it the night before. For a few seconds I just looked at it. The same folder Mark had never bothered to ask about. Then I closed the drawer again. There was no reason to rush. Mark believed he was already in control. People who believe that usually reveal much more than they should. Instead, I picked up my phone and made 2 calls. The first was to an old friend named Daniel Ross. Daniel had been a property lawyer in this city for nearly 30 years. We had worked together more than once back when my construction business was still running. He answered on the second ring. "Well," he said with a small laugh, "this is a surprise." "I need to ask you something," I said. "Serious question or interesting question?" "Both." I briefly explained the situation. The lottery. Mark's plan to sell the house. The real estate agent he had already contacted. Daniel was quiet for a few seconds. Then he chuckled softly. "Well," he said, "that's going to be awkward for him. Very awkward." I leaned back in the chair. "That's what I thought." "Technically," Daniel continued, "no one can sell that property without your authorization. Not the occupant. Not a family member. And definitely not a man who just won the lottery. In simple terms," Daniel added, "he can't sell your house." "So the sale can't happen?" I asked. "Oh, it can start," Daniel said calmly. "But it won't finish." He paused for a moment. And if someone pushes the process without understanding the agreement, things can become very complicated. I smiled slightly. That might already be happening. After we finished the call, I placed the phone back on the desk. Then I made the second call. This time to the real estate office Mark had contacted earlier that morning. The receptionist answered quickly. "Good morning, Wilson Realty." "Good morning," I said calmly. "My name is Harold Bennett. I'm calling about a property on Oakridge Street." There was a short pause as the woman typed something on her computer. "Yes," she said. "We just received an inquiry about that address this morning." "I imagine you did," I replied. "I just wanted to make one thing very clear." I spoke slowly. "The property owner has not authorized any sale. And any attempt to list the property would be incorrect." Another pause. "I see," the receptionist said carefully. "That information will be noted." "Thank you," I replied. When the call ended, I placed the phone back on the desk and looked around the quiet room again. Mark believed he was moving quickly. He just didn't realize the ground under his feet had already changed. Speed only works when you're moving in the right direction. And Mark had just started running straight into a wall he couldn't see yet. And the faster he moved, the harder the fall would be. Mark came home that afternoon looking unusually satisfied with himself. I heard his car pull into the driveway and the front door open with more energy than usual. "Good news," he called out before he even stepped fully into the house. Like a man who believed he had already won. Hannah appeared in the hallway first. "What happened?" Mark held up his phone like someone showing off a trophy. "I spoke with the real estate agent," he said. "She's excited about the property." He walked into the kitchen and dropped his keys onto the counter. "She says houses in this area are moving fast right now." I was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee when he noticed me. For a moment he hesitated. Then he smiled. "Harold," he said, almost cheerfully, "you'll appreciate this." He sat down across from me like we were about to discuss a business deal. "The agent wants to come see the house tomorrow." Hannah looked uncertain. "Tomorrow?" Mark nodded. "Just an initial walkthrough." He leaned back in the chair, clearly enjoying himself. "She thinks we could list it within a week." I took a slow sip of my coffee and watched him carefully. "That sounds ambitious," I said. Mark grinned. "When you have $95 million behind you, people tend to move quickly." Hannah glanced at me again. "Mark." "What?" he said. "You should probably talk to Uncle Harold before scheduling something like that," Hannah said quietly. Mark waved his hand dismissively. "It's just a viewing." Then he turned to me again. "You don't mind, do you?" The question wasn't really a question. He had already decided the answer. I placed the cup down on the table. "No," I said calmly. "I don't mind." Mark nodded, clearly satisfied. "Great." Then he stood up again. "The agent will be here around 11. He started walking toward the hallway but stopped for a moment. "Oh, and Harold?" I looked up. "You might want to start looking at those apartments we talked about." He said it casually, like the decision had already been made. He smiled again before disappearing upstairs. Hannah stood in the kitchen for a moment longer. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "You don't need to apologize," I replied. She hesitated. "Mark just gets carried away. Money has that effect on people," I said. She nodded slowly, then followed him upstairs. The house became quiet again. The kind of quiet that comes before something important happens. I finished my coffee and washed the cup in the sink. Then I walked down the hallway to my study. Tomorrow morning the real estate agent would arrive expecting to see a house ready for sale. Mark believed everything was already arranged. The meeting. The listing. The future. But what Mark didn't understand was that tomorrow wasn't the beginning of his plan. It was the moment his plan would stop. Because there is one thing every real estate agent asks before listing a property. One simple question. Who owns the house? And tomorrow, Mark was finally going to hear the answer. The real estate agent arrived exactly at 11 the next morning. Mark had been ready long before that. By the time her car pulled into the driveway, he had already walked through the house twice, opening curtains, adjusting chairs, and making small comments about what could be improved. Natural light sells houses, he said at one point. I simply watched from the kitchen table with a cup of coffee in my hands. At 11 sharp the doorbell rang. Mark moved quickly to answer it. A woman in a gray coat stood outside holding a tablet and a folder. Good morning, she said professionally. I'm Laura Jenkins from Wilson Realty. Mark shook her hand enthusiastically. Mark Collins, he said. Thanks for coming. She stepped inside and glanced around the hallway. Beautiful property, she said politely. Mark smiled proudly. It has a lot of potential. Laura nodded and opened her tablet. Before we begin the walkthrough, she said, I just need to confirm a few details for the listing. Mark gestured toward the living room. Of course. She looked down at the screen. First question, she said. Who is the legal owner of the property? Mark didn't hesitate. I am, he said confidently. The room became quiet. Laura looked up from the tablet. Your name, she asked. Mark Collins. She typed something quickly. Then she stopped. A small crease appeared on her forehead. That's strange, she said. She looked up again. According to the county records, the registered owner of this property is Harold Bennett. Mark blinked. For a moment he looked genuinely confused. That's temporary, he said quickly. He's family. Laura nodded politely. I understand. But for legal purposes the owner must authorize any listing or sale. She turned slightly and looked toward the kitchen. Toward me. Mr. Bennett, she asked. I set my coffee cup down on the table and stood up. Yes, I said calmly. She gave a small professional smile. Are you interested in selling the property? Mark looked at me. Hannah looked at me. For the first time since the lottery, Mark's confidence had disappeared. The confidence he had carried for days was suddenly gone. I walked slowly into the living room. No, I said. The word landed in the air like a closed door. Laura nodded once and closed the folder. In that case, she said politely, there isn't much for me to evaluate today. She turned back to Mark. I'm sorry for the misunderstanding. Mark looked like he was trying to find the right words. You don't understand, he said quickly. We were planning to sell. Laura shook her head slightly. Only the property owner can make that decision. She gave one last polite nod and walked toward the front door. A moment later the door closed behind her. The house became silent again. Mark stood in the middle of the living room staring at the floor. What just happened? He asked. His voice sounded very different now. I looked at him calmly. What should have happened from the beginning? He ran a hand through his hair. But we talked about selling. You talked about selling, I corrected. He looked up at me again. For the first time, there was no arrogance left in his voice. Why didn't you say anything? I thought about that for a moment. Then I gave a small shrug. Because sometimes, I said quietly, people need to hear the truth from someone who understands the rules. Mark said nothing. Hannah stood quietly near the hallway, looking between us. I picked up my coffee cup again and sat back down at the kitchen table. The house felt quiet again. The way it had always been before Mark started making plans. For 8 years Mark had walked through these rooms believing control was something you could buy. But control isn't about money. It's about understanding the ground you're standing on. And sometimes the most powerful move you can make is simply to wait until the right question gets asked. Because patience often reveals who really holds the power. That morning, the right question finally had been. Who owns the house? Thank you for listening. Calm justice doesn't shout. It keeps records.